We like to think that when someone goes to court, justice is done. The bad guys, they're proven to be guilty and they're punished. And the good guys are found innocent and allowed to go free. And I'd like to think that that's the way it happens most of the time. But we all know that's not the way it always happens. Even in America, sometimes the courts simply get it wrong. And there have been times when an innocent person has spent many years in jail for a crime that he did not commit. And so, sometimes the justice system simply fails. Sometimes it gets it wrong. Back in Jerusalem, 2,000 years ago, a Roman ruler named Pilate ruled over a case in which he totally blundered. He got it completely wrong. In fact, he actually pronounced the man on trial to be innocent, and yet sent him off to be executed. How does that happen? So it seems that Jesus Christ was the victim of that flawed trial. But really, Jesus was no victim at all, because everything was taking place according to prophecy, as Jesus was just hours away from dying on a cross. John 18, verse 28. Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now, it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," they objected. This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. The Jewish leaders considered Jesus a major nuisance. They wanted him gone. When Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey to adoring followers, he was officially declaring himself the Messiah, the Savior of the Jewish people. After his donkey ride, Jesus turned over the tables of the money changers in the temple, which disrupted their business. So Jesus was challenging the religious establishment. He became very popular, and the religious leaders came to the conclusion that the only way to end Jesus' influence over the people was to end his life. So to keep their way of life, they would end the life of Jesus. But he hadn't done anything deserving of death. In fact, he hadn't done anything wrong at all. But that didn't stop the Jewish religious leaders. They had Judas hunt him down in the middle of the night so they could arrest him. And they took him to Caiaphas' house to have him tried. But when the Sanhedrin assembled, they weren't looking for justice. They were simply looking for some kind of charge that they might tag him with. Matthew 26:59 says they were looking for false evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. When Caiaphas asked Jesus if he was the Messiah, Jesus didn't deny it. And so Caiaphas charged him with blasphemy, and the Sanhedrin started shouting out, "He's worthy of death." So the religious leaders pronounced a death sentence on Jesus. But the only problem was they didn't have the legal authority to put Jesus to death. Rome ruled over Israel, and only Rome could legally execute people for their crimes. So they had to take their case to Pilate, the regional governor of Judea. Pilate was living in the governor's palace. Now, some think that the palace was located in the Tower of Antonia, the fortress adjacent to the temple grounds. The advantage of that location is that since it's right next to the temple grounds, any disturbance of the temple could be immediately dealt with. But it's more likely that Pilate lived in the palace built by Herod the Great in the western part of Jerusalem. It would be more lavish than the fortress and just seem more like the kind of place a governor would live. They came knocking on Pilate's door very early in the morning. The Greek word translated early means the fourth watch of the night, or what the Jews would call the morning watch. The morning watch was from 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock in the morning. Now remember that Jesus was arrested at night, And following his arrest, he was tried before Annas, the former high priest, Caiaphas, the current high priest, and the Sanhedrin. And now he's brought before Pilate, somewhere between 3 and 6 in the morning. Since Roman officials started meeting with the public at daybreak, it was probably closer to 6 when Jesus was brought before Pilate. So the religious trials had gone on all night. And you would think it to be unusual for trials to be held at night when the rest of the city is sleeping. And it is. In fact, Jewish law states that no trial is to be held at night. And yet, here are the Jewish religious leaders breaking their own law in order to get Jesus executed. So the religious leaders in Jerusalem were all stirred up when they got to Pilate's house. But Pilate had the job to keep peace in Judea. Normally, Pilate lived in Caesarea, and he liked Caesarea. Caesarea is on the seacoast and has a beautiful beach. It'd be like living in Malibu. But during the great feasts, he thought it best to come to Jerusalem in case a riot or a rebellion took place. Passover could be a dangerous time because emotions ran high as the Jews remembered their deliverance from bondage. And just as God had delivered them from Egyptian bondage long ago, they might get it in their heads that God was ready to deliver them from Roman occupation now. So Pilate would come in from his beautiful seacoast mansion in Caesarea to Jerusalem. Definitely was not a pleasure trip for him. He would bring with him extra soldiers to help maintain the peace, just like we use our National Guard in times of trouble. Pilate beefs up the military presence in Jerusalem because he doesn't want to take any chances. As Pilate is biding his time in Jerusalem, members of the Sanhedrin show up with Jesus. And we notice that they go to the house, but not in the house. They didn't want to enter Pilate's palace because they didn't want to become ritually unclean during the Passover time. If a Jew went to a Gentile's house, he became unclean for 7 days and couldn't take part in any religious festival during that time. So let's understand what's going on here. These religious leaders were very concerned with stepping into an unclean Gentile house for fear of contamination, but had no problem whatsoever planning murder. And in their eagerness to get Jesus executed, they broke many of their own laws. They kept their bodies clean by refusing to enter Pilate's palace, but their hearts were far from clean. Since the Sanhedrin wouldn't enter the palace, Pilate came out to meet with them, probably in a courtyard. He wanted to keep the Jews happy. He needed to keep peace over the area in which he governed. It wouldn't look good to Caesar if a riot broke out in Pilate's territory. So although Pilate didn't really want to be in Jerusalem or bothered with this Jesus case, he felt he had to hear him out in order to keep them happy. Pilate asked what charges they had against Jesus. He knew something was fishy about this case. Pilate had certainly seen, or at least heard, about Jesus' entry to Jerusalem a few days earlier. And so he understood the motives of these religious leaders. So Pilate demanded that they file a legitimate charge against Jesus. Well, the Jews had condemned Jesus for blasphemy, but that charge didn't mean anything to Pilate. That was just a local Jewish religious matter, not something that Pilate would be bothered with. And so the Jews didn't answer Pilate directly. They beat around the bush. They knew they really had nothing on Jesus that would convince Pilate to condemn him to death. And yet they really needed Pilate to render the sentence. Why was it so important to get Pilate involved? Well, we've already mentioned that only Rome could legally pronounce a death sentence. Now, although that's true, sometimes Rome kind of looked the other way. There was the case of the spontaneous execution of Stephen, as well as the near stoning of the woman caught in adultery. So the religious leaders might have gotten away with quickly and somewhat privately stoning Jesus to death. But they wanted Jesus to be executed publicly. They wanted to make an example of him. But more than that, they wanted Jesus to be crucified. In the Old Testament, it's written, anyone who is hung on a tree is under God's curse. And back in Old Testament times, the body of an executed criminal was often hung on a tree or impaled on a post in order to serve as an example, a warning to others. It was also meant to add shame and humiliation to the condemned person's punishment. But by nighttime, the body had to be buried because prolonged exposure to a dead body would desecrate the land. So anyone hanging from a tree was considered cursed by God, since he had been executed for committing a major sin against him. The Jewish leaders wanted to kill Jesus by hanging him on a cross, so that he might be utterly disgraced in the eyes of the Jewish people. But only the Romans could crucify criminals. By hanging him on a cross, people would believe him to be cursed by God. And if he were cursed by God, he certainly would not be fit to be their Messiah. But it was also God's plan all along that Jesus would be crucified. When Jesus spoke about his coming death, he always spoke of crucifixion, not stoning. And so death by crucifixion fulfilled prophecy regarding the kind of death that Jesus would die. Since the Sanhedrin didn't really have a valid charge, they said to Pilate, "If he were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." That's a rather snide comment, isn't it? Can you imagine that really happening in a court of law? Imagine that in a court sits a defendant with his lawyer, and at the table across the aisle is a prosecutor, and the judge enters the room from his chambers, and he announces, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is quite unusual. I don't have a case on my docket for this afternoon. Mr. Prosecutor, what are the charges against the defendant?" And the prosecutor rises to address the judge and says, "Your Honor, the defendant is obviously a criminal. Otherwise, why would we have brought him to court?" Wouldn't that send up a red flag? Isn't it the job of the judicial system to determine if the defendant had actually committed a crime? And isn't it customary for a valid charge to be presented, something that the defendant reportedly did to break the law? Well, Pilate saw a red flag as well. He knew that something wasn't right. And so he said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." At this point, the Jews told Pilate the special charges they had decided to bring against Jesus. They had tried to make himself king of the Jews. And Luke's gospel fills in this detail. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Messiah, a king." Well, these were all lies. He never told people to stop paying the taxes. In fact, he said the opposite. He said, "Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, and to God that which is God's." And he certainly was not trying to overturn the nation. Christ talked about a spiritual kingdom, not a political one. However, when the Sanhedrin said that Jesus claims to be a king, this caught Pilate's attention. This is a charge that Pilate would have to look into, because it was a crime against the Roman emperor for any person to set himself up as another king. In the Romans' eyes, there could only be one king, and that king was Caesar. Verse 33. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked. "Or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. Pilate had a private, interview with Jesus. And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" This was really the only thing Pilate was concerned about. Now, Jesus certainly didn't look like someone trying to make himself a king. In our minds, people look a certain way. Mass murderers look a certain way, computer hackers look a certain way, bank robbers look a certain way, drug dealers look a certain way. And Pilate probably expected to meet a sullen, belligerent rebel. But instead, he met Jesus. Not angry, not combative, but calm and collected. And Pilate must have known that the charges were just ridiculous. He would have been very happy if Jesus would simply say, "No, of course I'm not a king." That would get Pilate off the hook. But Jesus answered Pilate's question with a question of his own. Is that your own idea? Or did others talk to you about me? If it was Pilate's idea, then Pilate was thinking of a political king, a threat to Roman rule. If it was the Jews who talked to him, it was a Messiah, a spiritual king. So Jesus was asking Pilate to clarify, are you talking about a Roman king or a Jewish king? If Pilate had a Roman king in mind, then Jesus could be considered a rebel. But if he was thinking about a Jewish king, there was no threat to Rome. Pilate sarcastically replied to Jesus, saying, "Am I a Jew? Your own people turned you in. What is it you have done?" Pilate, of course, was not a Jew. His point was they had no interest in Jewish matters. Pilate just wanted to dismiss the case. And his remark to Jesus was sarcastic. Jesus was not a prisoner because Pilate had arrested him, but because his own nation's leaders had arrested him. And Pilate figures where there's smoke, there's fire. So he presses the matter. "What have you done?" And Jesus replied, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders." In other words, Pilate has nothing to fear. Jesus is no threat to Rome. His is a different kind of kingdom. His kingdom is from another place, from heaven. If his kingdom were an earthly kingdom, he and his followers would have fought those who arrested him. But his kingdom doesn't come by rebellion and violence, but from submission to God. Well, then Pilate says, "Aha, you are a king then." So Pilate still isn't getting it. And Jesus replies, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." And so in this statement, Jesus gives evidence of both his divinity and his humanity. He said he was born to be a king. The fact that he was born means he is human. But he also said he came into this world to testify the truth. He came into this world from another place. He came from heaven. Jesus' kingdom wasn't established by power or politics. He didn't run a rebellion to establish a kingdom by force. Neither was he politically elected by the people to be their king. His kingdom was established by God. His purpose in coming was to testify to the truth. Earlier the same evening, Jesus told his disciples, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." So Jesus didn't just know the way, the truth, and the life. He was the way, the truth, and the life. He was and is the answer to all of humanity's problems. Pilate replies by saying, "What is truth?" Well, that's a good question for us today as well. Because the world says that truth is relative. Truth is what I want truth to be. I can have my truth, and you can have your truth. But there is no objective truth. So Pilate kind of expresses a similar thought. What is truth? In other words, who can really know the truth about anything? Maybe Pilate was cynical or perhaps sincere, but Jesus just stated that he is the truth. Unless we accept the truth about Jesus, we are forever lost. Verse 38. With this, he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him. But "It is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the King of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now Barabbas had taken part in an uprising. Well, Pilate realized Jesus wasn't a threat to Rome. And so he goes back to the crowd in the courtyard and he says, "I find no basis for a charge against him." At that point, Pilate really should have let Jesus go. Pilate had the power and the authority to simply set Jesus free because he was not guilty of any crime. But he didn't have the courage to do the right thing. He was afraid of those who opposed him, afraid the crowd might start rioting. Problems like that could mean that Pilate could be removed from his position because of being unable to keep the peace. And so Pilate played politics. Pilate decided to use a little bit of psychology on the people. There was a custom to release a prisoner during Passover as a show of goodwill. And Pilate knew that Jesus was popular with some of the people, and he certainly had not done anything wrong. And so he offered to release Jesus. But the chief priests were influential with the people. When Pilate offered to release Jesus, he was met with a resounding no. Well, who do they want released instead? Barabbas. Barabbas was a hardened criminal. He was guilty of things like murder and rebellion against Rome. Today, he might be considered a terrorist, someone who murders and stirs up social unrest for a political purpose. And the fact that he had rebelled against Rome may have made him somewhat of a hero with the people. National feelings increased during Passover, and a vote for Barabbas was a vote against Rome. But Barabbas was dangerous. He was a threat to civil society. And the real irony here is that they demanded the release of a man who had committed insurrection, the very crime that they had falsely accused Jesus of. The chief priests wanted Jesus killed at any cost. The people called for Barabbas to be released, and Jesus was on his way to the cross. As we conclude this study today, I want us to see three takeaways in this lesson. And first, that Jesus is holy. The Sanhedrin couldn't find any fault with Jesus. Well, they tried, but they failed. And so in the end, they made up some false charges based on false witnesses. They twisted the truth of Jesus' words, and they incited the crowd to hate him. Pilate couldn't find any fault with Jesus. He could tell the charges were just all drummed up. He tried to release Jesus. He washed his hands in front of Jesus' accusers, and he said, "His blood is on your hands." And so the Sanhedrin tried to give the appearance of holiness. They did all the outside stuff very well. They refused to step foot inside Pilate's house. They wouldn't dare let their feet get contaminated by a Gentile floor. But while they put on their show of holiness, they were planning Jesus' murder. They gave the appearance of righteousness, but their hearts were dirty. Jesus didn't give the appearance of holiness. Jesus was holy. And a godly life is a life like Jesus. A life that doesn't just look good, but strives, with the Spirit's help, to live for Jesus. The second takeaway is that Jesus is heavenly. Jesus said that his kingdom is not of this world. His is a heavenly kingdom, a spiritual kingdom. There are a lot of people who consider themselves Christians, but they have mixed allegiances. They have one foot in heaven and one in the world. They want the benefits of heaven, but they want the acceptance of the world. But Jesus wasn't accepted by the world. The world rejected him. And if we truly live for him, many will reject us too. But that's okay, because this world is not our home. Ours is a heavenly kingdom. And finally, Jesus is humble. He is God. He is omnipotent. He had said himself he could have called 12 legions of angels to save him from his enemies. But he was accused, arrested, mocked, beaten, and crucified. He didn't have to allow any of this, but he came from his heavenly home to die for our sins. He humbly laid down his life in our place, not because he had to, but because he loves us. Jesus, God's own Son, humbly laid down his life for sinners like me and you.